can automatically capture invoice header and line item details in order to create Dynamics records using this data. It'll do this by using Datahaven's OCR extension. So in this case, I'm starting out in Datahaven for Outlook, which allows both nav and non-nav users to have access to the workflows that are associated with your Datahaven for Dynamics implementation. So in this case, I'm viewing a workflow queue called Pending OCR, and there's 3 invoices in that queue. This queue is being monitored by our OCR engine, and as soon as we have enough invoices in the queue to create a batch, which my batch size is currently set to 4 invoices, then the OCR engine is going to pick these invoices up and process them automatically. So in a normal workflow data entry process, an end user might monitor this queue and do manual data entry in Dynamics. But in this case, the OCR engine is going to monitor this queue and do the data entry for us. So I received an email, an invoice via email over here. So I'm going to grab this attachment from right here within Outlook, and I'm going to drag it into the Datahaven for Dynamics workflow. So now this invoice can be processed along with the rest of the invoices. So I'm going to drag that over and drop it directly into the workflow. So now I see that there's 4 invoices in pending OCR, and the OCR engine immediately picked those up and started processing those 4 invoices. We could see that the count for our workflow queue was 4, and now it's 0, and we can see that all these invoices moved into the OCR processing. So what that tells me is that the background processes are processing this batch of invoices. That'll take a few seconds for a batch of only 4 invoices. And while that's running, you might be asking yourself how an OCR process can be useful for AP invoices, because every invoice format is vendor generated. We're always looking for common pieces of data on every invoice, such as invoice numbers, PO numbers, dates, line items, and then totals, which the total for this invoice is on the second page. But these amounts can be these values can be located in different places on every invoice, depending on the vendor that generated these invoices. So Datahaven for Dynamics is able to learn what every vendor's invoice template looks like. So when it reads the invoice, it looks at the layout of the invoice, which we call a fingerprint, and it matches it up to the vendor, and then it knows where to look for all the data automatically. And the setup of the fingerprints is not an IT manager or power user function. It's performed by the data entry users while they're doing their data entry, and we'll get to see an example of that as we move into the next part of the demo. So we've got 4 invoices that went into OCR. The background processes have run and processed them. So now we're going to do the next step in the process, which is verification. So the verify process is where the operator reviews the results of the OCR process. So we can see in this case that all the data was recognized for this invoice. So that means that the system had seen this vendor's invoice format before, and it knew where to look for all the data, and it knew where to populate that data into the data entry window. Also, you'll notice that the fields that are listed here are listed in different colors. So these fields up here in blue ran through a set of configurable business rules that help make OCR results better. And they passed all the business rules because they're listed in blue. They didn't fail. The business rules, examples of business rules could be checking to make sure that we have valid dates. So we checked the date format and made sure that this is a valid date. We also do some more complex business rules, such as adding up all the line totals, making sure that it matches up with the invoice total here. So OCR technology has come a long way, but it's not 100%, especially when you're dealing with vendor invoices that could come in varying qualities. So the business rules help make OCR better by identifying problem areas of the invoice and bringing them to an operator's attention, so they're only having to do data entry by exception rather than having to key every field on the invoice. So right away, we can go down here and take a look at this field that's listed here in yellow. And that field a special OCR-specific business rule called a low-confidence character check. So in addition to running math or date validations, the system also assigns a competence rating to every character that it reads on the invoice. And if any character falls below a certain threshold, it flags the field in yellow and then flags the individual characters in red. When I use hotkey navigation, it takes me straight to the characters that I need to review. So not only am I doing data entry by field exception, it's breaking down the exceptions into individual characters on the invoice. I can look above my data entry area and it shows me a little picture or snippet of the area that I'm keying in on the invoice. So I don't have to look back and forth between the invoice and the data entry area to do my verifications. But if I do want to see the area of the invoice that I'm currently working on, then I can go over and look on the right-hand side and it highlights that area of the invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and review all the exceptions that were identified and make any corrections that are necessary. A correction, in order to perform a correction, all I have to do is type over the area that the system has identified, and it automatically replaces that character with whatever I type. So while I'm doing this, you'll notice that I'm iterating through the line item details on this invoice. So in addition to capturing header information, the system also has the capability of capturing line item information, even if it goes over to a second page of the invoice, which you can see that this invoice is 2 pages, and it just flipped over to the second page to verify the line item details on page 2. If we look at a grid view of the details, we can see all the details that were captured automatically on this invoice. So I'm glad I didn't have to type those in because it would have taken me a long time to key this invoice. In this case, the way that we've set up our demo is that it's going to this invoice is going to be treated as a non-PO invoice. And so when this data gets exported over to NAV, it's going to create a brand new non-PO purchase invoice in NAV, and it's going to populate all the line item details, and it's automatically going to code these line item details based on standard vendor purchasing codes. And we'll see how that works as we move along in this to a later part of this demo. So I'm done with this invoice, so now I'm essentially going to move it on to the next invoice in the batch. So for this invoice, we can see that most of our data entry fields are blank. So that means that the system didn't recognize a fingerprint that would match up with this vendor. So perhaps this is the first time that this vendor has sent us an invoice, or maybe the invoice switched their invoice or the vendor switched their invoice format. But regardless, we're essentially going to train the system to recognize this vendor's invoice from right here within our data entry area. And keep in mind that right now I'm playing the role of a data entry operator and not an IT person or a power user. So essentially, the data entry user is going to do the invoice recognition right here in line with their data entry function. So I'm going to start out by associating this invoice image with a vendor. So I type in a partial vendor name. Then we're going to grab the zip code as cross-reference information for this vendor. I'm going to click Lookup Vendor, and it does a lookup in NAV to find the vendor ID that goes with this information that we keyed in. So now I've associated this vendor number with this vendor's invoice. So now I need to do data entry for the rest of the fields, and we can see that the invoice date is automatically filled in already without me having to do anything. That's because of a technology called IntelliCate, which uses keyword lookups to automatically find keywords on the image and find the data element next to that keyword. So in this case, it found the word date, and it looked to the right, and it found date. It did the same thing for the total. It found the word total, then it looked to the right and found the total. And that's very important for a field like total because it could be located higher or lower on the invoice or even on a different page from the first page, depending on how many pages we have. So with IntelliCate that uses the keyword lookup, we're able to find that piece of data regardless of where it's located on the invoice. For the rest of the fields, we'll do data entry by using click and key. So this allows me to click on the image, and it automatically populates the data entry area. So there I captured my invoice number. Now I can go down and do the same thing for the tax. And not only is this a fast and error-free way to do data entry, but also the system's remembering everywhere that I click, and it's going to store it with this invoice fingerprint. So the next time that we get an invoice from this vendor, it'll know where to look for that data on the invoice. We'll also need to tell the system how to recognize the line item details for this invoice. And to do that, we teach the system what the first line looks like, again by using click and key. So I'll click on all the different pieces of data within this invoice. And I click Find Details. So based on me telling it what the first line looks like, the system's able to find all 7 lines on this invoice automatically. So that's all for this invoice. I've essentially taught the system to recognize this vendor's invoice format. So the next time that we get an invoice from JWS of Colorado, we won't have to repeat this invoice identification step. It'll just automatically recognize all the data off of the invoice like it did for the first invoice that we processed. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next invoice. One thing I'll point out is that at the top of our page here, it shows us the document count within this batch that we're working with. So right now we're on document 2 of 4. Now what you're going to see is when I finish processing this invoice, is it's going to skip over the third invoice and go directly to document 4 of 4. That's because the third invoice in this batch doesn't have any errors that are identified by the OCR process. So in that scenario, it skips the verification process, and it's just automatically going to go into Dynamics without the operator having to verify that invoice. So that shows how when certain business rules all pass, then the system can be set up for truly touchless AP processing to greatly enhance your efficiency by using this technology. Now for this invoice, this is another invoice from JWS of Colorado within this batch. And you can see that all the data is still blank here even though we just set up that fingerprint. And that's because we haven't exported this batch over into Dynamics yet, which would cause it to save this fingerprint into the fingerprint library. But you'll also notice this sticky available button that's present at the top of our screen here. So what that tells us is that there's a fingerprint within this batch that matches this vendor's fingerprint. When I click that, we'll see that it applies all the zoning and setup that I did for this vendor's invoice, and it automatically finds all the information on this invoice without me having to repeat that setup step of setting up the vendor's fingerprint. So even though the batch hasn't been sent over into Dynamics yet, we could still take advantage of that of the invoice creation step that was processed earlier, and that's a pretty common scenario to get multiple invoices from the same vendor in the first the first time that you do business with a vendor. So this allows you to do it without having to move those invoices into a separate batch. So we're going to process this invoice as a PO-based invoice. So I'm going to switch my invoice type to PO. I'm going to go over here and grab my PO number off the invoice. It's worth noting that if this vendor hadn't printed the PO number on the invoice, I could also do a lookup. So when I click the lookup PO button, it shows me a list of all the open POs for this particular vendor, and I can select one from the list, and it automatically assigns that based on me selecting it from the list. At the same time, it also ran purchase order line reconciliation against this invoice. And I could tell that because my button up here, the POLR button, which stands for purchase order line reconciliation, turned red, and the number next to it turned into a 1. So what this tells me is that one line on this invoice did not match the purchase order in NAV. So let's go take a look why. My purchase line reconciliation module shows me the 2 lines that were matched up automatically on this invoice. The match is occurring based on the item ID, the quantity, and the price being matched up with the PO item number, the PO quantity, the quantity received, and the unit price. So we are using the quantity received, so this is performing a 3-way match against the receiving and the ordering that's occurring in NAV. Regarding the item ID lookup, the item IDs that are stored with the item IDs in NAV are typically not the item ID that shows up on your vendor's invoice. The vendor typically puts their own item ID on the vendor invoice. So we're using a combination of vendor cross-references and vendor item numbers that are associated with your NAV items to automatically match up the vendor's item number to the NAB item number on the PO. So as I mentioned, these first two were matched automatically based on the criteria that we have set up for our matching. But this line down here didn't match. When we go down here and review the line, the quantity, price, and item description matches against the quantity that's on the purchase order. However, it looks like the item ID that we have here is different from the item ID we have stored in NAB. So I can tell that this is the correct item. So I'm going to go ahead and click to automatically match this item. And we can see here that it shows that this item, that this line was matched by the operator as opposed to the lines that were matched automatically. So we can use this information to drive a workflow in the system to automatically update your item catalog with the correct item numbers. So in this case, the system's going to continue to learn and get better and perform more automated matching the more that you use the system. So now when I go back to the main screen, we can see now that our polar button has turned black and the number 0 here is next to it, which means that all of our lines our invoice is fully reconciled against our PO. Now if we iterate through our line item details, we can see that the PO line number is filled in for each one of these. So each invoice line has been matched up with a PO line. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this invoice off. And since this invoice has been processed as PO and we've matched everything up, this invoice is going to automatically post in Dynamics when it goes into Dynamics, as opposed to creating a brand new purchase invoice like it's going to do in the case of the non-PO invoices. So basically we finished out our batch, and now the last step in the process is running, which is export. And export essentially packages up all the data that we just recognized and verified into XML, and it sends it over to Dynamics. And now Dynamics is going to create the brand new purchase invoice records. Then also it's going to match the documents that were used to create these records up and automatically associate them with the new invoice records that are created in Dynamics. So the document is going to show up next to the record in NAV automatically. So we'll switch back over to Dynamics. We'll go to our Role Center. And we'll see that our documents got routed into the management approval queues that we have set up in Datahaven. So the way that we set the system up, we're automatically routing the documents to individual queues based on the first letter of the vendor's name. So here we have a set of queues set up, one for vendor names A through L, one through vendor names M through Q, and another R through Z. So if we go take a look at the invoices that are stored there, here we can see the invoice from JWS of Colorado, which starts with J. So obviously that fits into the A through L. So what this shows is how we can set up business rules for automatically assigning invoices to appropriate personnel and dividing up the work in such a way that makes sense for your organization. This isn't the only option. There's lots of options for rules for routing invoices. This just shows an example of how we can accomplish that using the routing rules that are built into Datahaven. So we'll go ahead and process this invoice. So to do that, I'll select the document and I'll click Launch NAV Card. So from here we can see that this document was automatically created in NAV along with all the header information. The line item information is also populated, and I have my original source image alongside my record here. So I have everything I need to review the GL coding that we have over here, which you can see that the GL codes were assigned automatically, including the tax GL code line was coded a little differently from the rest of the lines because that's how we set the system up. We did this coding automatically by using the standard vendor purchasing codes. So if we go look at our vendor, we go to the related information, we go to standard vendor purchase codes, we drill down a little further into this, then we can see that the GL account that was assigned to this vendor was 67400. So that's the account that was used to code this particular invoice, as we can see right here. So now we're going to want to go ahead and we're first going to want to approve this invoice. So I'm going to click the Approve button from right here within my viewer. That's going to approve my invoice, move it into the invoice approved for payment queue. So now this invoice can be posted. So I'm going to go ahead and post this invoice. Now I'm done handling this invoice. This is the invoice from Plunger Lift Systems that we didn't see show up in the OCR verification window. When we open it up and look at it, we can see again that it automatically processed this invoice, including entering all the header information and all the line item information. But in this case, it used a different purchasing code because this is the purchasing code that we had set up for this particular vendor. So again, I'm going to repeat the same process. I'm going to approve this invoice. Now I'm going to post it. So now we've handled 2 of our 3 invoices. We'll go ahead and take a look at our Steward Apothecary invoice as well. So this was our large invoice that had lots of line item details. So we can see here that it populated all my line item details once again. In this case, there's quite a few line item details, and again, it used a different purchasing code. In this case, it used the office supplies purchasing code for this particular vendor. In this case, instead of approving this invoice, we'll show an example of how you would process this invoice as an exception. So we'll say, for example, that we didn't receive this particular item. So I might highlight that item and put a note on this invoice that says, did not receive this item. So now the next person to review this invoice will be able to clearly see why we're taking it out of the payment process. So I'll go ahead and save my annotations. And not only can we see them on the face of the invoice, but also we can see the annotations in the invoice audit trail as well. So when I go look at the notes, I can see everything that's happened to this invoice, including everybody who's viewed it, where it was created, where it went through the OCR process, and finally where it was annotated as did not receive this item. So I'm going to route this invoice to an exceptions process, so now it can be handled as an exception. So now we've got a couple of invoices that we posted for approval, including that PO-based invoice that we processed. So if we go through and take a look at those real quick, we'll switch to our posted purchase invoices. We see that we have the Plunger Lift Systems invoice that we just processed. So we'll preview that real quick, and we can see that this is that small $554 invoice that skipped the OCR verification process. Then we have our JWS of Colorado invoice that was processed as a non-PO invoice. Then also we have our PO-based invoice, and as I mentioned before, this invoice automatically was posted because the PO matching, because the invoice fully matched the purchase order and the receiving. We also see that there's some supporting documentation that was associated with that purchase order. So that's all reflected here in the posted record alongside our posted purchase invoice. Now the next step in the process is to go ahead and pay these invoices. So I'm going to do that by creating a payment journal. I'm going to give it today's date. We're going to make this a payment. I'm going to choose the specific invoices that I'm getting ready to pay. I'm going to actually choose the vendor and the invoices instead of doing the suggest vendor payments. So we'll pick Plunger Lift Systems, and I'll click Apply Entries. It'll show me all the open invoices for Plunger Lift Systems, and here's the one that we just processed right here. So we'll go ahead and assign that invoice as one that we're getting ready to pay. We can see here that it automatically brought that invoice so that now we can review the invoice here alongside our payment journal record before we post this payment. We'll also generate a second payment, and this time we'll create it for JWS JWS of Colorado, and we actually have a couple of invoices that we can pay here. So we'll use this one and this one. So now when we go over here, we can see that it actually includes all the invoices that we're getting ready to pay. Then also, if there's any supporting documentation, such as the purchase order, then it shows that alongside our payment journal record here as well. So I have all the documentation that I need so that I can perform a review during my check run. So finally, I'm going to go ahead and post this payment. So now it posted my payment, and I can review all this information by going to the vendor ledger. So we'll go down and we'll find JWS of Colorado. We'll look at our ledger entries. Here, if I click on the individual invoices, then you'll see it just shows me the documentation that goes with that specific invoice. But if I click on the payment, then we see a view that's very similar to the view we saw in the payment journal that includes all the invoices that were part of this payment, as well as any supporting documents that went with those invoices. So that's all for this demo, and hopefully you've been able to see how using Datahaven for Dynamics OCR extension can greatly improve your efficiency involved with handling AP invoices.